he appointed 25 people in it, and he said to these people, and of course these were leaders from around the state on these issues that were named to this commission, including some high-profile state's attorneys, judges, lawyers, leaders from DOC, people that work in the community treatment community. He said to them, by 2025, I want to reduce the population of Illinois Department of Corrections by 25%. So go have a bunch of meetings and figure out how we're going to do it. And that's exactly what this group did. I went to a lot of those meetings because I was working for the state at the time. And they met, they talked, they looked at data, and then they came out with a report of 27 recommendations, a few of which we have implemented here in Illinois, many of which we haven't. Interestingly enough, as I just said, the population of DOC is way down. But if you look at the policies that have been enacted and you take a close look at the numbers, the consensus is that the reason the prison population is down isn't really because of any policy that we enacted based on the Commission of Criminal Justice and Sentencing Reform. It has far more, this is really interesting to me, far more to do with street level policing and what's happening in the courts in Cook County and in Chicago. Obviously, Cook County is our biggest county by far. They're the driver of our prison population. They send way more people to state prison than any other county. So when Chicago police changes how they do things on the street, and if they're arresting less people and committing less people to court, which is exactly what's happening, it has a huge effect on our prison system. And if you think back to that map, it makes sense. If Chicago police changes what they do over here, far less people go into the system, far less people are going to be in the prison system. So kind of in general, the status of Illinois is we had a governor that came in that made this one of his flagship issues. A lot of great work was done. A commission put out a report. Our prison population is down, which I think is a good thing. Less people can have more programming in prison. But the reason our prison population is down isn't because we moved forward on a bunch of these recommendations. It's really because of what Chicago police is doing on the ground in Chicago. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit in depth about a specific program that I spent 6 years working in called Adult Redeploy Illinois. That is one of many policies and programs that states or counties or cities can identify and work on to help reduce our over-reliance on incarceration. And I actually have a handout on this one. So the Adult Redeploy Illinois program it's a state program of state funding and technical assistance or guidance that is for counties all across Illinois. They can take these resources and set up alternatives to incarceration at the county level for nonviolent offenders who would otherwise go to state prison. And the whole premise behind this program is when counties encounter somebody in their system, and when counties send people to prison, there's kind of a built-in incentive for counties to send people to state prison, because once a county sends somebody to state prison, all of a sudden the state is paying for that person and not the county. Now, us as taxpayers, we're paying for it all anyway. But if you are a county judge or you're a county prosecutor, you have an incentive to shift that cost to the state. So one of the key pieces behind adult redeploy is to try to reverse that incentive. The state is saying if we can give funding to counties so they can set up special court programs or special probation programs, then they can run the programs to get people what they need, and they don't have to send people to state prison. State lawmakers love this program because it takes some state investment up front to give money to counties, but at the end of the day, it saves the state a whole bunch of money because it costs over $20,000 to incarcerate somebody in the Illinois Department of Corrections every year. But the average cost of an adult redeploy program at the county level is more like $4,000. So this is seen as a great investment for the state. And it's also seen as a program that leads to far better outcomes than an outcome we might get if we send someone to state prison for 5 years. They don't receive much programming in prison, and they come out and they're not much better off for it. So the idea is, if we give money to counties and we incentivize them to run programs that research shows will actually work, which we like to call evidence-based practices, it will lead to lower crime and it will help people exit the criminal justice system. All right, next slide. This map is slightly outdated, but it shows where across Illinois these special adult redeploy programs exist. And I'll talk a little bit about what they actually look like on the ground. The money for adult redeploy programs, which comes from the state, by law, has to go directly to counties. So what that means is, if you as a member of a community group were wondering, why don't we have adult redeploy program in my county? I think we need it. You'd have to go convince somebody on the county board, or maybe the elected prosecutor, or maybe a judge, somebody that works in the county. You'd have to convince them to go after this state grant funding.
And the key reasons would be, aside from it's the right thing to do and a good return on taxpayers' investment, why should counties do it?
Or why shouldn't they?
It's the right thing to do, and it's a good investment. It helps meet community needs, and that's often the trigger in counties that the public sees or maybe judges see. And in many counties across Illinois, one of the big needs right now is our opioid crisis problem. So if there's not enough treatment for the opioid crisis in any given community, and people are seeing people come into the jails and prisons, a county can take adult redeploy funds and use part of those funds to provide more treatment to people.
And how much do counties, the whole budget is what, in the state is how much money, you know?
The whole budget is about 7 to 8 million. And when counties go after the money and run programs, depending on how big the county is, the programs might be about $200,000 a year. They might be $300,000 a year, which in the grand scheme of things and all that money we spend on the criminal justice system isn't that much money. I like your question of why wouldn't a county do this? It's, to be honest, I think sometimes it just comes down to people who work in bureaucracies, and I say that with love because I used to work in a bureaucracy, feeling overwhelmed and feeling not having a lot of capacity and just not having the time to take a step back and to think about what kind of program could we set up here, and then not having the time to complete all the paperwork to get that to the state. So I think that's part of it. Another big part of it is not everyone feels that the criminal justice system has to be reformed. Not everyone feels that alternatives to incarceration are better than incarceration. Public opinion on that is actually changing slowly, and there's been some public opinion polling in Illinois that shows that actually a lot of people, close to 88% of the public, do favor alternatives to incarceration, which I'm happy to hear that statistic, but oftentimes policymakers and politicians are a little bit behind the curve on public opinion.
Would redeployment create a new county department, or what department would it fall upon?
Yeah, that's a great question. It doesn't create a new department at the county level. In general, it'll be a county department that's gonna take the lead in any given county and go after the grant funds and do the paperwork, and then they will house the program.
I guess I'm asking what department is it who's going to feel overwhelmed, you know, or possibly?
So what I've seen around Illinois is sometimes that's county probation feels overwhelmed, and they just don't feel like they have the time to go after these grant funds. Sometimes it's the state's attorney's office. So can you go back real quick? So these are the things that, these are what adult redeploy programs actually are and what they look like. So there's basically two different versions of adult redeploy programs. There's problem-solving courts, which we sometimes call specialty courts in Illinois, and those are drug courts, mental health courts, and veterans courts. Those are special court programs set up for people with drug issues or mental health issues or veterans, that instead of somebody going through the regular court process and showing up in front of a judge every month and having the prosecutor and the public defender kind of fighting with each other, problem-solving courts use a team approach. So there's a team that includes the judge, the prosecutor, the defense attorney. Treatment providers from the community are literally part of the team, and when someone comes into the court, the team creates a case plan for them that is a marriage between court supervision, and they'll have a probation officer, but also the plan is very much about what is this person dealing with in terms of addiction, and what kind of services do they need, and what are we gonna do as a team to connect them to services, but also hold them accountable to changing their behavior. So these kind of courts are very different from the typical court processing. And then the other big kind of program are special probation program with services. So that might be a program run out of a county probation department, and in fact, LaSalle County, not too far from here, they run a special probation with services program through adult redeploy. So some of the grant funds can be used to pay for the services that people need, but really importantly, the funds can be used to pay extra probation officers, because when you have extra probation officers and you can train them, their caseloads go way down. So the probation officers in LaSalle County that are working on adult redeploy, their caseload is 25 people. So they can actually have a relationship with the person and help connect them to services. So this gets to your question a little bit about who are the people at the county level that are involved with adult redeploy. It's generally all of these people. And it takes a lot of collaboration, and the collaboration that it takes is not what we typically see. So I mentioned the problem-solving courts and the special probation programs. And this is just to paint you a slightly more detailed picture about what adult redeployed programs look like. Because a problem-solving court is certainly a different way of doing things, and it's innovative. And probation with special services is arguably innovative. But what I found working in adult redeploy across the state is the programs that exist, even, they take it to another level and even do more innovative things. And adult redeploy programs are in urban areas and rural areas and suburban areas, because that's our state. And it takes a different approach. So in rural areas, for example, a program will have drug treatment counselors that are part of a court team that are mobile, and they're driving around a judicial circuit that consists of 12 counties and meeting with the defendants in the program. And that's pretty unheard of. The typical court system is like, no, you show up to court, you show up to treatment, and if you're not there, then you're gonna get a ding and you might get violated. In-house CBTs, CBT refers to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a kind of, it's an approach to counseling that all the research shows is the best approach to use with people that have been involved in the justice system to get people to change their behavior. And it's really simple. At the end of the day, it's basically about stop and think about your behavior before you engage in that behavior. From my world of social work, we talk about and use CBT all the time, but the fact that people in the criminal justice system are now using it is a newer thing, and it's a really good thing. So there's a big probation program in the suburbs in DuPage County, and they have run with the CBT model. They've trained their probation officers how to engage in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is, when you think about the tail 'em, nail 'em, jail 'em approach versus the CBT approach, those are two very different things, and you're gonna have to train your probation officers. So that's an innovation. Another innovation in a court in Cook County is an alumni support program. Makes sense. When people come into these courts and then they graduate, and of course these are folks that have been dealing with drug addiction for much of their lives, it just makes intuitive sense that having a alumni support program would help somebody be successful. So adult redeploy funding can be used to help counties set up an alumni support program to make sure people continue to be successful.
What's the tipping point for counties deciding to apply for adult redeploy money? I mean, I can see that people are busy and they think they don't have enough money and they believe we should punish people for evil doing, but there must be something that you've seen now that sort of, that was the turnkey that said, we should do this.
That's a great question. Having one person or even two people in a county that in our work we tend to use the word quote unquote center of gravity. Having one person who might be a judge in one county, it might be a director of probation in another, who sees this opportunity and says, yes, I want to do this, and then they do it. And what I've seen over the past few years is sometimes that person is almost a lone wolf, but they have enough power, maybe because they're a judge, they just make it happen. But as a program gets up and running, the other stakeholders get on board. and then
Yeah.
become real partners
Yeah.
in this. And so folks that are skeptical at the beginning, oftentimes give them 6 months or a year, and they'll be some of the program's biggest supporters.
And unfair question, but conversely, who are the most frequent foot draggers?
It really depends on county to county, because I don't think it's about position, I think it's more about personality.
Right,
But I will say this, it's very difficult to get an adult redeploy up and running and even apply for funding if, I'll give you an example, if every judge in the county is against it. So, I just wanted to touch on a few other big issues in the world of criminal justice reform right now, and then we can chat about anything. But these are so big, I just didn't want to ignore them. And then there's one other thing that belongs up there. So we already talked about cash bail and pretrial detention and pretrial reform. Clearance rates and deterrence. This is, it might seem far afield from what we're talking about today, but it's just been in the news lately and really important, so I want to mention it. And this is far more relevant to Chicago, but we're all connected as far as I'm concerned. So deterrence is this concept that people in criminal justice reform use, and it refers to the fact that if people know what the punishment is for something, they'll be deterred and they won't commit the crime. Most of the research shows that concept of deterrence actually doesn't work to change people's behavior. And one of the reasons that is, I'm sure there are a lot of reasons, is that most of the crime that's committed, most of the crime is not caught at all. So if you think of it like a funnel, and up here at the top level you have all this crime being committed, and think of it as a funnel, the percentage of crime that's actually caught and intercepted by the system is just minuscule compared to the amount of crime being committed. So you can, that's one of the reasons why deterrence doesn't work. And a very timely example of deterrence is the homicide and shooting clearance rate in Chicago at this moment in time. And what that means is if somebody kills somebody, is the Chicago police going to identify who that offender was? So that's what the clearance rate is all about. Right now, the homicide clearance rate in the city of Chicago is 17%. So that means if you kill somebody in the city of Chicago, you have an 83% chance of never getting caught. The shooting clearance rate is even lower. So if you shoot someone and don't kill them, I mean, the odds are completely in your favor that you will not be held accountable by the formal justice system at all. I think we're going to hear this stat up in Chicago more and more because we're heading into a mayoral race leading up to the election in February 2019, and violence is a big issue right now. Reform of the Chicago Police Department is a big issue right now, and this stat about our homicide clearance rate is an important piece of that puzzle. And the fact that our clearance rate is so low is, I say our because I live in Chicago, that is very different from other big cities. So LA and New York, their clearance rates are like 60%.
Why is that, do you think?
Why is ours so low? I believe our clearance rate is so low because the relationship between the Chicago police and the communities they serve is really struggling. It's a really bad relationship. And some of it might be about resources too. If you don't invest in the right amount of detectives, in the Chicago Police Department, then they're gonna have a really hard time solving crimes, but I think more importantly, because the relationship between police and the communities they serve that are most affected by violence, which tend to be Black and brown communities of concentrated poverty in Chicago, people aren't gonna share information with the police because they don't trust the police to get the job done, and the numbers bear that out, and then no one's sharing information with the police, they don't have the tools that they need to solve the crimes. I can never say this word, the opioid crisis. That's a huge issue all across Illinois. I'm sure everyone in this room knows somebody has struggled with heroin addiction. We are beginning to recognize that, and I'll give you one example of a tool in the toolbox that we're starting to use to deal with this. There's a new thing called deflection programs, and deflection programs are programs that local law enforcement, like police departments, will use to help people get their addiction needs met without bringing them into the criminal justice system. And there's a program in Dixon, Illinois that has been a leader here in Illinois on this issue. So they set up a program run out of the police department where if somebody is struggling with addiction and they are not able to access treatment, they can walk into the police department and say, I need help. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's kind of the basics. And they run a program in Dixon. A state law was passed this past session that created more authority to create more of these programs. There's a funding opportunity right now at the state where local police departments can apply to get money to start these programs.
Princeton, Spring Valley, and Monroe County Sheriff's Office all offer that option.
That's terrific. That's great. And what is the kind of the state of the opioid crisis here locally?
As bad as everywhere else.
I'm sorry, you didn't-
Say again?
As bad as everywhere else.
So a quick note on the juvenile justice system, because we haven't touched on that yet. I work in the adult justice system. Of course, we are connected to the juvenile justice system, but there's a lot going on over there that is different from the world that I work in. So I just want to mention a few things. One, there's a whole concept nationally, and we're talking about it locally too, called quote unquote emerging adults. And emerging adults refers to people between the ages of 18 and 26. And the scientific community and the criminal justice community has recognized that our brains are not fully developed until we're 26. And kind of that science is helping to create a recognition that emerging adults is another subset of people, and we should be doing things differently in our criminal justice system. We could be using different approaches with this population to get better outcomes and to help exit people from the criminal justice system. So that's some work that's going on. And just the concept of emerging adults has helped move some juvenile justice reform policies. We had a few state laws passed in the past few years related to juvenile justice that are worth mentioning. One is about expunging a juvenile record. It's more detailed than that, but at the end of the day, the law made it easier for people that have committed crimes when they were a kid to get their record automatically expunged, which of course is helpful for someone to move forward in their life despite some mistakes that they might have made when they were a teenager. we had a law that passed related to automatic transfer. And I'm not a legal expert, but just to give you an idea of some of the laws and policies that change. The way it was before is if somebody was a certain age, they could be in age before 18. For some crimes, they could be automatically transferred into the adult system. So we had a law change that made some changes there. It cut down the number of circumstances that kids could be automatically transferred to the adult system. Kind of the one other issue that I didn't mention that weaves through all of this stuff that coulda, shoulda been on the other slide, and to me it's in the air I breathe, so I think I forget to mention it at times. Our whole criminal justice system, and you've just kind of heard about how vast it is and how it's really expensive and doesn't lead to big outcome to good outcomes. There's no question that it has a disparate impact on people of color. So at Black people and Latino people, so at every step of the way, the data is showing that there's a disparate impact where if you are a person of color, you are going to get treated more harshly. And when we look at who is locked up in prison and jails, we will see that people of color are far more represented than white people, and that's because of the disparate impact and discriminatory practices at every step of that criminal justice system, and the numbers show that. So that's a huge issue in the criminal justice system. And of course, I didn't mention this explicitly, but in addition to people of color being overrepresented in the criminal justice system, obviously poor people are overrepresented, and people with behavioral health issues, and behavioral health refers to addiction issues and mental health issues, those folks are overrepresented in our criminal justice system.
And cognitive ability, for that matter. An awful lot of people with developmental disabilities who grow up learning to comply with the orders of people with more influence. So if they're suspected of a crime, there's considerable evidence to show that they will confess to the crime faster than almost any other group of people, because they're used to saying, somebody says, "Did you commit that crime?" "Well, yeah."
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And when we kind of, to take it a step further, when we think about, if we accept the premise that people's brains aren't fully developed till they're 26, add on top of that, maybe they have a cognitive disability. Add on top of that, maybe they're being detained pre-trial because they don't have the money, or their mom or dad doesn't have the money to get them out. They have no idea how long they're going to be detained. We know most cases don't go to trial, so they're just going to plead to some charge that may or may not be reflective of the crime.
There was a piece this week, NPR focused on, I think, women in prison and the methods of, in women's corrections, how they were easily penalized. They were treated in a way that said, you know, if you're obnoxious to the guard, you're more likely to get a longer sentence at a higher rate than men do, which was interesting to me.
Yeah.
You know, as we look at this, the idea of expunging your records if you commit a crime when you're an adolescent. There is a model, started in Washington, D.C., of youth courts and restorative justice programs that have shown a 70 to 90% reduction in youth offenses, nonviolent offenses, when you have a youth court system where the jurors are young people, often who have been in court, and they work with time banks, believe it or not. It's a voluntary program that essentially gives young people a sentence with supervision and partnerships and mentoring, that if they complete the sentence, usually community service, anger management class, so many sessions with counseling, they don't get a record, so it doesn't have to be expunged. And it strikes me that can have a really powerful effect, because once you're tagged in the juvenile justice system, you're often perceived as a bad kid. First thing people do is look for what kind of record you have. If you don't have a record, it also gives, it's a sort of a second chance for adolescents who are making mistakes that the proof is so far that there's a significant reductions in reoffensive reduction. They're nonviolent, but it's a wonderful approach. And I mention that because I'm wondering, there are lots of alternatives that we're all hearing about, like the district attorney in Philadelphia, who basically wants to educate judges. I think in Philadelphia, the cost of incarceration is something like $40,000 a year. And in places, I think in California, it's as much as $80,000.
Yeah, right. In the youth system, it tends to be a lot higher.
Yeah.
Education.
So, but what happened was, and maybe some of you know about this, but apparently the district attorney in Philadelphia said, when you sentence somebody, before you lightly say, well, we'll give you 10 to 20, think about the cost. And he's got that into the brain of people who are prosecuting and defending and plea bargaining and judges who say, oh, maybe we ought not just sort of throw in another 10 years, which I just wonder what you're hearing in the criminal justice community about that.
I did hear that
People objected to it right away, of course.
that the new DA in Philadelphia was doing that. I personally think that's brilliant. To
Just take it into account.
to have people
Yeah.
explicitly say, this is how much it's gonna cost to incarcerate somebody. I do think here in Illinois that it is on people's minds more than it's ever been. I really do think that. And part of that is kind of the public awareness that's been happening about how much this stuff costs and what we're getting from it in terms of outcomes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
this business of someone languishing in a county jail for 2 or 3 years until their case is finally adjudicated, what happened to a speedy trial? The right to a speedy trial, how's it being subverted? And what is that right?
It's
What-
correct.
How's that spelled?
Someone who's in jail for 3 years is there with the consent of their attorney also.
Is that it?
Who's waived demand to speedy trial.
So how long can a
Or
person
some
be?
finding that there's some incredibly outstanding, or some situation that would override that interest, which is almost impossible. So it's an extreme case for someone to, and it's larger cases, and it's because it takes time for evidence to play out and be discovered, or it's the public defender's caseload, where the public defender, without the enthusiastic consent of his client or her client, is getting or consenting to extensions. But there is a speedy trial, right? And
There is, but it's not spelled out.
no, but it is, and it's enforced. If it's not being enforced, there's someone is agreeing to it not being enforced on behalf of that inmate. Also, I just wanted to we do have a team court in Bureau County.
Do we still have that?
That's
I was
great.
gonna
Which-
ask. Team court. We still have that?
Yes.
Okay.
You had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted, something you touched upon called restorative justice. I just wanted to expand on that. Is there any place in the Illinois, either the criminal code or as it relates to a legal framework for either imposing or creating a circumstance for someone who has been adjudicated, that there is a provision for restorative justice, or is that just serendipitously offered in that particular court setting, either by the judge or the prosecutor or the defense attorney?
Yeah,
Because it's missing from your map.
well, that's interesting. I don't know if there's anything in the code that alludes to restorative justice in our statutes. There is a bunch of restorative justice happening in Illinois at various levels of the criminal justice system. I didn't mention it until now, but there are a few adult redeploy programs in different counties that use restorative justice to supplement the work that they're doing in the courts and the work that they're doing in probation. And in particular, they have a long-standing restorative justice program that operates out of Decatur in Macon County that they use with adults and kids. There's a relatively new restorative justice court in Chicago in the North Lawndale neighborhood, and it's a whole alternative court program that is built around restorative justice, and it's very neighborhood based. So to answer your question, I'm not sure if any of it's in the code, but a bunch of it is going on. But of course, without it being in statute, we rely on personalities and intermittent funding to keep these things
And
going.
just to follow up, I mean, these examples of where it's taking place in these various venues throughout Illinois, how carefully are they being studied and examined in terms of evidence-based research as to their effectiveness and usefulness as a deterrent?
I would say that is spotty. And that's a key thing with any of these, any social program really, but certainly in the criminal justice system, collecting data and doing evaluations to actually find out if a program is leading to better outcomes is really important.
Could you define or clarify what restorative justice looks like?
At the end of the day, everybody involved in the circumstance looks the way they did or feels the way they did before they got into the circumstance. Essentially, it's not quite that simple, but it's a bigger concept than rehabilitation. Or it also takes into restoring the victim to where they were before they happened. It goes into restoring the offender to where that person was before this happened. And we try to back everybody back out of the situation. And stop me if you want to do, if you have a different thought of it, but essentially you want to restore everything back to that point in time before this happened. Everybody involved.
Almost always it involves an apology
Right.
and compensating the victim for whatever he or she lost. And in good programs, in Madison, Wisconsin, it started in one police district. And now every high school in the city, and at the police request, there are teams of community organizations, prevention programs, mental health professionals, school counselors, community policing officers, and others who work with law school students and lawyers to reduce the number of juvenile offenses through a philosophical approach based on restorative justice. And it was a long struggle, but the point is, there's not just the isolated little youth court. They're all working together. And I mean, it's not perfect, but they can demonstrate evaluation and counting are built into it. And they can show, school by school, the number of tickets for violations for which juveniles, either in school or out, has been significantly reduced. I mean, amazingly so. I mean, I'm often a skeptic, but this is one of the more successful approaches. Which leads me to my question, which is totally unfair to ask you. In a perfect world, everybody doing their best, and what you've seen so far, what are the promising approaches that you would say, if you were the queen of criminal justice, what would you recommend? What would you love to see more of?
I would like to see more of, a community treatment infrastructure in the community so people can get what they need in terms of housing and behavioral health treatment and healthcare and community supports, and access to strong quality education while we're at it. I would like to see more of that in communities, just as the norm. And I think if we do that, we'll have far less people coming into the criminal justice system, and that same system should be there, and people should be able to fully access it if they do come into the criminal justice system, when they come out. That's kind of a broad umbrella, so within that, reentry housing is something I care deeply about. When people touch the criminal justice system, they should still be able to access housing, even though they have a criminal record. Just an example of an innovative thing that we're doing in Illinois that in my ideal world we would do a lot more of. There are 2 reentry life skills prisons that we've started in Illinois. One is in Kewanee and one is in Murfreesboro. And in Kewanee in particular, we remodeled an old youth prison and we changed